First of all, this presentation is more about a philosophical idea than a comprehensive piece of research. So it's more about the philosophical and historical speculation on the archive and how archives can exist in radically different forms. And most of the presentation is theoretical with minimal emphasis on technology, but at the end it suggests ways in which technology might help us to conceive and realize radically different forms of archiving and narrating memory, rather than simply replicating existing physical forms and modes of archiving in digital world. So I will actually read, I'm better in reading, and also the text will be presented on the projector so that you can follow. The main thesis of this presentation is that modernity has imposed a detached perspective on the past, treating the archival practice as a kind of independent, abstract, and impersonal process of representing the past and articulating the collective memory. The collective memory that is based on a Cartesian duality between subject and object, between human and the environment, between cause and effect, between the past and the present. The archive and the past has become an inanimate repository, a fossil to be looked at but not to be lived. The complexity of its human component has been transformed into monolithic, abstract, discrete variables located on a temporal axis or on geographical coordinates that lack significance and relevance to actual and lived cultural experiences. So the idea is that in modernity, we treat time and space as empty, as what physicists say, independent variables, something meaningless as to their cultural aspect. And so we treat also the archive and the archival process in these terms. This distance view is often justified by claims to a positivist objective approach to history and collective memory because on the surface it appears to be free of any subjective biases and perceptions. This is misleading, however, as power dynamics are embedded in the way the past is archived. The archive in this setting loses its social and cultural significance and becomes merely an apparatus of political power. Colonial fantasists, fascist imaginaries, and ideological discourses often employ the historical archive as a material to construct narratives that open rifts between temporal and geographical locations to create an impression of otherness, alterity, and justify violence and imposition. The aim of this presentation is therefore to discuss ways for democratizing the historical, mostly the historical archive, and reintegrating it into the community as an active, vital site of contact between societies, cultures, and temporalities, rather than treating it as a detached agent of enclosing the past in lifeless archival forms for a mere self-affirming speculation for the modern subject. To liberate the archive from its empty temporal and spatial signifiers and to transform it into a site, a place, not just a location, of social and cultural interaction, by restoring its social and cultural significance and function in democratizing way, rather than allowing it to remain as an instrument of ideological assertion. Based on a quasi-paradoxical Lacanian Deleuzian approach, these are usually not doing well together, but okay, we try to deterioralize the historical archive from its modern understanding and to find new modes of archiving and registering the collective past, and thus different modes of narrating the collective memory. Lacanian theory is a useful tool to give us an insight into how a subject perceives, signifies, and records reality, and the Deleuzian perspective in its broader sense will inform us on how the archive might take a non-dualist, non-causal form, allowing it to retain its vitality and escape the Cartesian subject-object mode of understanding that creates detachment and asymmetrical power dynamics. The presentation will refer to digital interactive projects that deal with this issue and that, in our opinion, succeed in this endeavor. At the same time, inspired by these works, a theoretical framework for new forms of archiving and narrating memory will be developed based on the notion of metaphor as interpreted by Lacanian theory, but also heavily influenced by the philosophical approach of Gilles Deleuze the anthropological thinking of Tim Ingold, and the sociocultural approach of Ian Chambers and his reflections on the archive. Metaphor, in this sense, the linguistic or the visual metaphor, is to be seen as a site of temporal and spatial convergence as a bridge that bridges the distance between the subject who records, who archives, and the object that is being recorded, which is archived, between the past and the present, between memory and experience, between the archive and the social expression. So, to summarize, I will summarize a lot, okay. To summarize, in modernity we are used to a recording subject and a recorded object. So I propose here actually, a different way of archiving reality, the historical archive, based on the idea of metaphor, to use a metaphor that bridges this gap between the subject and the object. The historical archive, from a modern point of view, involves the aspect of recording the properties of an object in a given temporal and spatial coordinate. It consists, therefore, of a Cartesian look upon collective memory, in which the very notion of memory is tied to a representational capacity of the mnemonic object in relation to its temporal and spatial parameters. In summary, in modernity, the significance of the historical archive is linked to a simulated reproduction of a mnemonic object in respect to socially meaningless spatial and temporal values. Scholars such as Tim Ingold and Ian Chambers have sought to challenge this conventional approach to the historical archive and to examine further dimensions in which an archive can take shape. The anthropologist Tim Ingold, for example, uses an 8th century riddle inscribed on a parchment attributed to a Veronese monk to reimagine society's relationship with its past, using society's relationship with the soil as a model. The soil is a metaphor for the past, suggesting things that signify the past, such as the burial of the dead, buried ruins, and the previous agricultural year. Through this analogy, it becomes clear that society's relationship with the soil is linked to the way it relates to and perceives the past, to its ways of registering or narrating memory. The parchment, to which Tim Ingold refers, is written in dialect of the early Romanesque language, and it says, Se parepa boves, alpa pradalia, arapa alpo versorio, tenepa necro semen seminapa, and can be translated to, he drove oxen before him, plowed wide fields, held a white plow, sowed black seed. The riddle concerns the process of writing and is indicative of a triangular relationship between the written word as an archive, the land, and society's relationship with the past. The black seed is a reference to words, the plow is a reference to the pen, and the white fields is a reference to the leaves of the pages. According to Ingold, the riddle was intended to describe the process of writing to an illiterate public. It is interesting because it illustrates the way in which pre-modern societies conceived of writing, narration, and memory through allusions to the cultivation of land and soil, certainly not by chance, since these societies were largely agrarian. The relationship of pre-modern societies to the land and the soil provides a paradigm for how they perceived not only written narration, but also their relationship to the very process of narration and, by extension, memorizing. According to Ingold, the pages which at the time were parchments, that is made of leather material, gave the impression of a layered carved plane rather than one-dimensional surface like paper. He then refers to the palimpsest as perhaps the ultimate model for this relationship between cultured memory and soil. Since parchment was expensive in the Middle Ages, the palimpsest was used as a cheaper alternative for writing. It was a kind of sheet that had been deliberately damaged, scraped, in order to remove the previous text and write something new, that is, the sheet from which the text had been scratched, creating a surface that had been etched, eroded to allow the writing of a new text, just as the earth is plowed down to allow it to be used again. So we have not exactly different layers, but one layer coming into the other layer, the older coming up and the new going down, like the soil, like the earth when it is plowed. And here we see some images of some palimpsests. So different chronologies in today's terms exist in one piece of paper, palimpsest. So the parallel that Ingold draws with the palimpsest is particularly interesting because it shows that through this process of deliberate erosion, the older inscriptions are actually brought to the surface as the new ones are dug in. So in this form of inscription, we do not have one layer of inscription on top of another, but a kind of cyclical interchange in which the past is constantly brought to the surface as the present is driven underneath. So there is a process of a dialogue happening between the old and the new, a kind of relationship between the new and the old that is very different from what we are used to in modernity. In modernity, the new, or the way we perceive the new, is superimposed on the old, creating layers upon layers that demarcate between the older and the more recent. As Ingold describes, the very idea of vertical boundaries between Earth, subsoil, and the sky were not clear in pre-modern societies, and this is shown also in how modern societies, these pre-modern societies were conceiving and describing of the past as emerging through a dialogue with the present. It is indicative that in Maronite traditions in Cyprus, burial was not seen as something to leave behind in the past, as we are used to today, but rather it was seen as an act of preserving some aspects of the past within the present. So we have this fundamentally different way of of archiving the past in pre-modern societies. And okay, now I'm generalizing obviously, but in pre-modern times, the past was embedded within the present, and in modernity, we have these layers upon layers to distinguish the new layer from the older layer. And we can see that happening also in this kind of things, in this generalization, modern versus traditional, modern versus primitive or whatever. So it's as if the modern, it is, the distinction between modern and traditional is clean cut. So these differences can be seen, for example, in the way the stories are told also in medieval European art. John the Baptist is depicted by Alvaro Sanchez against the background of the Flemish city of Bruges, while the Dutch artist Gerard David depicts the theme of the adoration of the Magi against the background of a 16th century city with characteristic European medieval Gothic Romanesque architecture. And even if these subjects belong to religious mythology than to historiography per se, the bottom line is that we are observing the narrative of the past, albeit the mythological one, in a way that is not classified in terms of a chronological before, but in terms that are integrated with the artist's present. This is confirmed by the lesser-known painting by an unknown artist that narrates the Battle of Jerusalem by Tito in 70 BCE. In this painting. In this painting, Jerusalem is depicted as a similar medieval Western European city with attributes that refer to the walls and towers described for the city of Jerusalem in 70 BCE, but more closely resemble the architecture of the neighboring Flemish city of Ghent, in which the artist lived in the 15th century. So we have the story of Jerusalem of 70 BCE, depicted with the architecture of Ghent of the 15th century CE. In essence, then, we observe that the past is not registered in terms of empty chronological or geographical determinants, but in terms of how it speaks to the sociocultural experience of the ordinary observer. Bruges or Ghent don't function as geographical locations in the works mentioned above, but rather as metaphors for Jerusalem, for example, of a particular relationship between the past and the present, between the local and the remote. Space and time were not empty, but charged with sociocultural meaning. Similarly, metaphor is used as a socioculturally meaningful register of memory, time, and space in pre-modern Cyprus. In the tombstone of a dead 18th century Mamluk sailor found in the Muslim cemetery of Jami Kebir in the center of Limassol, we can see interesting metaphors alluding to a register of memory of the deceased. The tombstone has no inscriptions or other verbal or iconic references to the identity of the person except for the plant known as Rosa persica, Persian rose, which is this plant there. And this is the actual plant. The use of floral motifs was a common practice in medieval European funerary structures, but in this case, it is not just simply used as a decorative element. Rather, the choice of this particular plant alludes to the sailor's homeland, Persia. If we look more closely, we can also see that it is placed in a pot to indicate this transition. Interestingly, the commemoration of the young man, denoted by the young Rosa persica, is shown through the use of a metaphor. So we know nothing about the identity of the sailor except for this reference to his identity through the metaphor of this plant. In another case, from the same cemetery, one reads on a tombstone, "He is the eternal, the Lord of death. I am the one whose rose blossom has withered before it blooms. I am he who has gone, yearning for his mother, his brother's care, who stayed in this foreign land, Omer Kaptan's son, Mehmet Emin Bey. Pray for his soul." So it is actually written on this tomb. The line in this scripture, "Pray for his soul," is an active component that invites the living passers-by to pray for Mehmet Emin Bey's soul, as if the memory of the past entered into a live dialogue with the living social fabric. So far, the idea suggested here is that metaphors can be used as socioculturally charged registers of time and space, of the past and of memory. Cult history and memory archive based on metaphors provide us with richer and more meaningful territories of the past. According to another theorist, Ian Chambers, the historical archive must be liberated from its empty chronological status and reintroduced into the sociocultural domain. Chambers uses the Mediterranean Sea as a paradigm and sees it as a plane for the unfolding of fluid dialogue between cultural and temporal alterities. Water allows for discontinuity rather than fixity. Trade and contact allow for a constant undermining of linear archival forms as well as traditions. And in his own words, to locate in the Mediterranean an aquatic archive, that interrupts the institutional organization of events, this implies tearing history away from chronology and the cult of origins. The Mediterranean becomes a contingent configuration, an agitated archive where the sea is history. Chambers, therefore, removes the conception of history as something to be looked at as another and suggests that history is something to be manifested in a dialogue with the present. What he suggests is an understanding through history and memory instead of understanding of history and memory. Furthermore, he restates, in other words, if we are to think with, not of, the Mediterranean and float in its diverse currents, we could consider a manner which it constitutes an interrogative archive and counter space, and to counter-argue understandings of the Mediterranean as a subject of historical and cultural formation that interrupts the logic that the world can simply be laid out flat as a map for the Westerner's gaze. So his idea is not looking towards understanding the history of Mediterranean, but understanding through the history of Mediterranean. This restatement about the aquatic archive suggests that this way of archiving the past is counter-hegemonic. It does not construct the image of the past as seen from a detached point of view, but rather keeps it as part of the continuous dialogue with the present, in the sense that the archive is a mediator, a point of creolization, of intersection with the present, in a sudden way that is not imposed by any Foucauldian epistemes. The right to register and narrate the past does not belong to an expert, but becomes a democratic right of the community itself, which negotiates and manages it on its own terms. Memory becomes a subject that lives within the community rather than an object to be looked. How does the concept now of metaphor we saw earlier relate to Chambers and Ingold's perspective? In essence, what Ingold and Chambers are talking about is moving away from the Cartesian view of history, archive and memory, and introducing a different way of looking at the past that is not based on the idea of the subject with an authority observing the past as an object. As we have seen, both in short suggest the dissolution of the boundaries that imply this Cartesian dipole, and on the contrary speak of the inclusion of the past into the present as a space through which intertemporal and interspatial interaction occurs. Memory is a space of contact rather than of remembrance. This idea is seemingly based on a Deleuzian, rhizomatic and schizoanalytic approach. That is, the Oedipal model of the past determining the present in opposition becomes absent in this model. Contrary to common view, this idea could work through the Lacanian roadmap and would be more meaningful if it did. In fact, in his early definitions of metaphor, Lacan introduces an algorithm for metaphor that goes something like this thing there. What this algorithm essentially suggests is that metaphor involves crossing the barrier described by the bar of the Saussurian algorithm, signified over signifier, which involves the emergence of meaning. That is, in cases of metaphorical meaning, the signifying operation of substituting the signifier for the signified corresponds to crossing this barrier. Meaning does not arise in the differentiation of the signifier from the signified or in the difference among signifiers, which is what classical Lacanian and generally constructivist theory talks about, and which refers to an inherent disparity between signifiers, meanings as arising through differentiation between signifiers, but metaphor constitutes the result of a particular operation that crosses this barrier. So it is not about a signifier and a signified in opposition, creating the meaning, but it is about a positive kind of meaning that does not arise from distinction, from differentiation. A metaphor, thus, is a bridge that connects two or more levels of meaning. In the case of this presentation, the past is no longer seen against the present, but by using a metaphor, the past is seen through the present. It's not present versus the past, it's past through the present. Metaphor enables for bridging of the gap between the observing subject and the object defined by it, because through metaphor there can be an identification between the subject and the object. The object can be lived and can live as an experience for the subject. The object becomes subject in a sense, and the subject becomes object. The Lacanian dictionary by Dylan Evans uses Shakespeare's phrase, "Juliet is the sun," to illustrate how a metaphor works in Lacanian theory. With this phrase, Shakespeare describes Juliet's dazzling beauty by using the sun as a direct signifier without referring to a comparative word such as like. If like were used, a simile, and for example, Juliet is like the sun, this would create a distance between the sun and Juliet, negating the power of the metaphor to act as a mediator between two levels of signification. So to summarize, a metaphor in this level could be used to have an understanding through memory instead of memory by establishing a bridge between the archived object and the subject observing it. Some interesting artistic explorations of this concept, not by me but from other people. The use of memory as a metaphor linking the present to the past rather than as an archive material defining empty temporal and spatial coordinates can be found, for example, in poetry as well as in art. It's particularly common in poetry, especially in 19th century poetry, and perhaps most notably in the symbolist movement, to use the past as a metaphor for a situation in the present. Probably the most obvious example is that of the Egyptian Greek poet Constantine Cavafy, where the past events function as metaphors for situations experienced either by the poet himself or potentially by the reader. In his poems, the present speaks through the past and the past speaks through the present, like the soil being plowed to bring into the surface elements that will nourish the present, as in the case described by Ingold. If we think of the metaphor as an archival device, then we can say that it is alive, socioculturally charged and agitated, as Chambers suggests. The archive, as a set of metaphors for the past, becomes a field in which conversation takes place between temporal alterities, between different temporal territories. And some of his poems that has this aspect of connecting the present with the past are these there. And another example is, I will read, probably the most complicated work that can be used as a paradigm for such an archive of metaphors is James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. The seemingly incomprehensible works begins to take shape when one begins to realize that each word, sentence, paragraph, or page functions as metaphor that simultaneously connects parallel stories together. For example, one word in this book, in this story, the fall, suggests a situation that resonates in many parallel stories that echo simultaneously within the same pages of the book. This highly complex book can be likened to a tesseract, metaphors that simultaneously embody stories, that the body stories projected on many levels at once. So this book is almost incomprehensible. But if you realize that each word works as a metaphor that binds together many stories, then you start to understand something at least. And yeah. In essence, what is proposed in this presentation is the abolition of treating an archive as a one-dimensional record of an object in relation to a dominant order, subject versus object, and the attempt to generate an impulse in the archive that gives it a dynamic and animated value, instead of looking towards the archive, seeing oneself through the archive. There's currently an interesting photographic exhibition at the Curium Archaeological Museum called Talking Hands by Theobistis Tilianou Lambert. This exhibition explores the personal narratives, this is another example by the way, explores the personal narratives of the local people living around the village of Episkopi near the archaeological site, who participated in the excavation of the antiquities in the area and whose role was a secondary one, but whose lives were affected by these archaeological activities. Rather than focusing on the archaeological artifacts themselves or their historical significance, the focus of the exhibition is to document the relationship between people, the people involved in the excavation, and the archaeological objects. In a sense, the people working on the site see themselves in the archaeological objects. They treat them as metaphors for their own lived experience on the site, and the photographs become an archive that registers this encounter. The archaeological objects reflect the people, not the claimed origins. Now, how digital technology could help us with this new kind of archival process? Digital technology can be particularly peculiar when it comes to undermining notions related to the archive. The basis on which the digital framework is built, as well as its purpose, at least its original purpose, is by definition, almost by definition, archiving, the recording and processing of data. It seems as an oxymoron then that digital technology could emancipate us from the narrow taxonomy of data, and in a sense, that may be the case. However, in an almost paradoxical way, contemporary digital technology, with its capacity for convergence, may also allow for a Deleuzian rhizomatic, if you will, fluidity in the classification of data. One such example is the project Empathizing with Views of the Landscape by David Flood of the University of Helsinki. Flood seeks to redefine landscape as a sociocultural configuration rather than a geographical coordinate using simple digital technology, not simple, but everyday digital technologies. Influenced by Tim Ingold, Flood sees the landscape as the result of interaction with the materiality of the environment rather than the representation of the perspective on it. Viewing landscape in this way as a performance practice happening between human and non-human configurations is fundamentally unclassifiable as opposed to viewing it from a representational perspective that establishes a spatiotemporal locus that could be classified using temporal and spatial abstractions. David Flood's project explores the experience of landscape as a configured, co-constructed social practice through the use of smartphone digital imaging and sharing. This shared experience of landscape allows for personal signification of the shared environment, the attribution of a personal metaphor that is relevant to the landscape. This sharing results in a co-created landscape that is the result of a social experience and has sociocultural relevance rather than landscape being an empty defined spatiotemporal coordination. Specifically, Flood organized workshops in different cities where participants were asked to participate in image-making practices through the use of their smartphones. Smartphones, a converging device of multiple communication technologies, were useful tools for co-creating multimodal narratives about the landscape by working and engaging with the environment. It is important to note that the participants did not have any predetermined plan or path in their interaction with the environment. Participants subsequently discussed their works, selected an image that mostly appealed to them, and shared their experiences and impressions of the environments they inhabited, presenting them as embodied landscapes, the result of a shared memory. Flood's main question in this project was, how do we manifest our understanding of the environment we live in through photographing and sharing, and how could landscape become a co-created social experience? The project demonstrates that by using multimodal digital technology, landscape can be liberated from its archival empty form and reimagined as a socially engaged practice, what Floods call socially engaged photography, where shared experiences describe and co-create a shared story about the environment. In terms of the present presentation, it also shows that the recorded archived memory of space and time can be redefined as a socially engaged practice. A photograph, which as an object is almost symbolic of the process of archiving in modernity, in the case of socially engaged photography, it is no longer about defining abstract spatiotemporal coordinates, but works as a metaphor for the community's relationship with the environment, linking space, time, and memory with the community. Finally, another ongoing project based on this idea is the exhibit project, which seeks to democratize the museum experience by allowing visitors to virtually co-curate museum exhibitions through the development of a smartphone app, thereby creating narratives about the past that are more meaningful to them, to the users, rather than simply adopting the established official museum narratives about the archaeological objects. In this way, the past is reclaimed and made socially relevant, and the archive becomes a living site of conversation. Once again, the archival objects become metaphors of meanings that are socially or personally relevant to the viewer, establishing a connection between different temporal and spatial realms. So actually, I have finished my presentation, but there is also another project that I would like to show you that is concerned with this kind of Deleuzian archiving kind of process by Glisman Pascal, which he uses algorithms to machine learning basically to create substances that they do not exist in reality, and he classifies them. And the idea is to bring this hybridity between the imaginary and the real into new forms of archives, more or less. But okay, I will not show you that. So I think I'm finished.